Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the ninth IPRRG presentation in our seminar series, the use of pest risk assessment and decision making in the biosecurity system. I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Melanie Newfield. She's currently working as an independent contractor in areas of risk assessment, decision making, and biosecurity. While she's taking a year's leave from the New Zealand's Ministry of Primary Industries. She used to work as the manager of plants and pathways risk assessment for 11 years and was a risk analyst for plant health 5 years before that. There's lots of experience in this area. She's worked on practical aspects of risk assessment, prioritization and management of invasive weeds, and a bit more on invasive species. And she's worked on the invasive species risk assessment, prioritization and management, some of the world's hottest and coolest locations. So mostly New Zealand, but also in the Mauritius, Niue, India, Maldives, and Antarctica. So she's got this particular interest in improving methods and skills in ways in which are practical and collaborative. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Melanie.
Right, kia ora tātou. I'm Melanie, as Darren said, and I'm talking about a piece of research that I've been doing as part of this year, and we called it a gap analysis. So it's looking at risk assessment and decision making in the biosecurity system. And by the biosecurity system, we've been quite broad in our definitions. So in New Zealand, we use the term biosecurity to encompass not just, say, security at the border for pests and diseases, but also managing incursions and also for established species in New Zealand. And so I've been looking across that system at how risk assessment is used and in particular its effect on decision making. So the context of this work is it's part of one of the national science challenges. And for those not in New Zealand, national science challenges are cross-discipline research programs focused on major issues in New Zealand. So there's one obvious one for climate change, for example. There's one on natural hazards like earthquakes and volcanoes. And the one that I'm working in, called New Zealand's Biological Heritage, is about protecting our species, protecting biodiversity, and also managing the harmful pests and diseases. And a specific project under this challenge has the title He Tangata, He Taiao, He Ōhanga, which loosely translates to the people, the environment and the economy. And it's looking at developing a risk assessment framework for biosecurity that looks at values in a holistic way. And by values, I'm talking about human values, social values, cultural values, as well as the economy and environmental values. And part of that development of that framework is also improving participation in the biosecurity system. So it's looking to develop a new risk assessment framework. One of the obvious places to start for developing a new framework is looking at what's already there, which I think is a fairly sensible place to start. And the obvious thing to do is a literature review, but as well as that, we're actually talking to decision makers to find out what they're actually using for their decision making processes, what sort of risk assessment inputs they use, and what their experiences are of using risk assessment and decision making. So that's the project that I've been doing, is these two parts, the literature review and the interviews. And start off talking about frameworks. The term framework is used quite loosely and quite differently. If you Google risk assessment frameworks, you find all sorts of things. Sometimes the term is used almost interchangeably with a model or a tool. Sometimes it's used slightly differently. So a framework tends to be not just, say, it might have a process in it, but it has a bit more than a process. Often frameworks have things like principles and criteria. Other times they're more strictly models with specific methods for doing those models. And I've distinguished in the work two different types of frameworks. So the most common one is a risk assessment framework, and these are probably frameworks that you would all be familiar with. The outcome is a conclusion about risk, such as a level of risk, and risk assessment frameworks are used as an input into the decision-making process. They're not making the decision itself. Decision frameworks are slightly different, and they have an outcome which is an action. So what are we going to do about importing this commodity? What requirements are we going to put on it to ensure that it can be safely imported? Are we going to eradicate this pest or not? That kind of conclusion. And it includes the whole process for decision making. So it's got big elements of communication in it. In general, you can't make decisions in biosecurity without talking to a number of people, whether that is formal consultation or whether that is a group of decision makers or a committee. And so those are less common, but they're also quite valuable. I've just put a few examples up to show you. So this is one called Debrief, and it's for the dairy industry to assess the risk of disease-causing organisms, and it looks at both what sort of vets and pathologists call endemic, which means established, as opposed to the biodiversity terming of endemic, as well as exotic, not present in New Zealand. It looks at information about these diseases. It looks at some scenarios for impact, and at the end of that, you end up with a rank. So your conclusion is a rank. Now, another type of framework for risk assessment that I thought I'd put up what might be the most familiar one to everybody here, because it's Climax and it's brown bum-rated stink bug. Generally, Climax is referred to as a model or as a tool, but it is broadly fits within the definition of what can be called a framework. It has a conclusion about the level of risk in different locations, and it is used for decision making. And that differs quite a bit from decision frameworks. And what I've put up are some really simple examples. And the first one is just a series of steps. The second one has process steps, but it also defines some interactions in the process and the way that there are two groups that work together. And another decision-making framework is a specific one for biosecurity, and this goes back to 2008, and it's designed for making all sorts of biosecurity decisions, quite basic and low-level decisions, but also quite big, complex decisions. And it has a series of steps. It has information gathering, and risk assessment can fit in with that as part of the information that's an input into it. There's consultation, and there's a little box underneath. I don't know whether you can see my pointer, but there's decision principles. So my general conclusion was there's a lot of frameworks. And for the project I was looking at, I looked at 10 decision frameworks. There's definitely more out there, but that I got a reasonable sample of them by looking at 10. Within the time I had available, I looked at 23 risk assessment frameworks, and then I found a review paper with 29, and that wasn't even close to a good representation of everything out there. What I did, though, was focused on project and sorry, brain's gone blank for a second, focused on how they looked at the values such as the economic, environmental and social cultural values. But for this work, I'll talk about some other aspects about those frameworks. And what was really important for both the decision frameworks and the risk assessment frameworks is almost all of them were aimed at specific types of decisions or questions. And very, very few could be adapted to answer a different question. So that was quite a challenge in the work. Some of the frameworks, honestly, I wasn't sure what decision or decision that they had in mind for being used, but they didn't really talk about it. But almost all of them were quite specific. And that was an interesting point. That one that I showed you, the previous slide of the Biosecurity Decision Framework, that was one of the very few exceptions. So that was what the literature told me. And then I went on to talk to a number of decision makers in the biosecurity system. Actually, I did this work in conjunction with Christine Reed. And so she did some of the interviews, but between us, we did 26 interviews, 24 interviews with 26 different decision makers in the biosecurity system. We tried to get a broad representation by looking at central government, local government and industry, different organisations, different geographical areas and different industries. But I won't pretend that this was anything like a random sample. We knew the approximate number of decision makers, and within a limited time we spoke to as many as that we could actually get. Some of them simply weren't available in the time. So this is not a random sample, and that's an important point when it comes to the next slide, which is how on earth do you actually analyse a bunch of interviews with people? And there's a number of different ways, but mostly they're not quantitative. And so anyone who's expecting a presentation with an equation, you'll know that I don't usually do presentations with equations at the best of times, but this one is really, really as far from the equation as you can get, and it's a qualitative analysis. And there are quantitative ways to analyse interview data, but they tend to involve pigeonholing people's answers into quite narrow boxes so that you can get something that you can compare. And although you get numbers, you tend to bias the data quite significantly by your own framing of how you design putting those things into boxes, which then you can analyse with numbers, and you kind of end up with potentially a quite misleading analysis. So the qualitative approach used in social science, and I specifically used a method that says it was developed for psychology but is used right across the social sciences, is called thematic analysis. And it's very conscious as you're doing the work that you are subjective, that you have a particular viewpoint. And the method really gets you to articulate where you're coming from in this work. So if you think, I was talking to people who make decisions in biosecurity based on risk assessment. And I spent, spent 11 years as a manager and 5 years before that as a risk assessor. So I've got the viewpoint of a risk assessor who advises decision makers. So I talk reasonably similar language with the decision makers because I work very closely with them. On the one hand, I could be on the opposite side because we've all had the experience of having our advice not listened to if we're advisors advising decision makers, but also worked in the biosecurity system. There's a real familiarity with that system, and so when I'm asking questions and interviewing people, they're not having to explain the basics of biosecurity to me, which is a positive on one hand, but on the other side, I've got all my own ideas. And you've got to be careful and conscious of the fact that you are putting your own ideas there. So that's sort of some of the rationale for the qualitative approach. Basically, you've got advantages and disadvantages, and the more clear you can be about those, the clearer the work. So the process that you actually go through is about reading through the data and looking for patterns of meaning. And these are called themes. And prior to having suitable computer software, people literally go through with a pencil and underline things. Actually, people used to even chop up little pieces and copy them and stick them in categories, which must have been incredibly labour intensive and painful. And I'm really glad I never did that. I was using a software package called Quirkos, which was exceedingly quirky. It's not the standard software used, but it was not $1,500 to buy, so it did the job really well. And as you can see in that little diagram, if you can see my cursor, there's little colours there, and those coincide with themes. So that piece of text had a number of different themes. One of them I remember was about use of a structured process. One of them I think was about the speed at which you're doing the work and the scaling of it. I can't remember all of them. It's a few months since I did that particular part of the analysis. I'm happy to talk more about it to people. It was completely new to me, I have to say. So I was really familiar with biosecurity and risk assessment and decision making, and completely unfamiliar with the method. So I had a social scientist who was guiding me on how to do it, which was really useful. And that paper I've linked there is one of the absolute excellent starting point, one of the really sort of grounding papers in that method. So you come out with some main themes or some dominant themes in the data. They're not, you've got to be careful that you're not actually saying that these apply right across the biosecurity system. They apply to the people that you spoke to. But what I found there is, first, that structured frameworks are not widely used for biosecurity decision making, not in the actual decision frameworks, but also wasn't clear how widely risk assessment frameworks were used. Certainly some of them were used, but not widely, not as widely as you might have thought. From the perspective of developing a new framework to consider values in a holistic way, decision makers were really trying to think widely about the values that they were considering when they made decisions, but not doing it in a systematic way at all. So there is, I think, a need for that type of framework. The other thing that really showed up a lot to me, and I admit that I have an interest in this, so maybe I was more sensitive to some people than some people would be, but trust was really important in how the decision makers that I spoke to talked about the risk assessment quality and its usefulness. I'm going to talk about two of these themes in a bit more detail from a perspective of what might be useful to IPRRG as risk assessors who are advising decision makers. So first, the point about trust. That to me was particularly interesting there. Decision makers that I spoke to, they trusted some risk assessments and they trusted some risk assessors and they didn't trust others. So it wasn't that some decision makers were really trusting and they just accepted everything that came to them. It was that they trusted some people and their work and they didn't trust others. And it was particularly the people who did the risk assessments that they either trusted or didn't trust. If they trusted the risk assessor, they trusted the work. And that was really important to whether or not you got listened to and whether or not your risk assessment got used, basically. Certainly fitted with my experience, but there were a lot of things that talked about that, and I might have a couple of quotes that I can give you from what people said. I think one of the classic one was, for me, it's also really important who's telling me that information. And so it's not what the information is saying, it's who's saying it. So what did that relate to? And I looked in a bit more detail for both the literature and what the decision makers said. And so there's a couple of obvious things. Decision makers talked about the knowledge and experience of the advisors who are advising them. And if they trusted that knowledge and experience, they trusted the advisor. They did look at the information sources the advisors were using, so they were doing a degree of validating that information themselves. But what was most interesting was when they said they didn't trust someone. And what came up in particular was they perceived some advisors as not understanding the context in which they were advising the decision maker was working. So the decision maker has a lot of factors that they take into account, you know, political, economic, balancing up different people's needs, and sometimes they perceived the advisors didn't get that context, and then they didn't trust their advice. The other time they didn't trust people is if they perceived them as being biased and coming from a particular perspective. And that somewhat linked with the literature. So the literature certainly identifies knowledge and experience in relation to trust as being important. People trust someone who's got a lot of knowledge and experience in something, sort of fair enough. But there's also concern and care, and that relates to that factor I said about mistrust, understanding the context or bias. Does that advisor care about the same things as the decision maker? That really matters to them. What didn't come up in the interviews with the decision makers was trusting the openness and honesty of the advisors. And that is in the literature is really important to trust. What wasn't clear was whether that was because decision makers didn't think openness and honesty was important, which struck me as really unlikely, or whether they actually had great trust in the openness and honesty of the people advising them. They really did take people at their word. They might be biased, but they're honest. They're telling things as they see it. So they're not actually deliberately lying. And I think one decision maker said, I always assume it's possible that the information I've got is incomplete or incorrect, but I also assume it's the result of the best efforts of good people. And that I think was quite useful. There's also a couple of quotes that really nicely illustrated the issues about context and bias. There's a lot of risk assessors see themselves as scientists, so risk assessment feels like a scientific exercise instead of a contribution to solving a real problem. And another one said they're siloed because they just think about their little bit in the world, and so all they're going to do is give you advice on their little bit of the world. And I don't know whether anyone's had that experience with decision makers, but I definitely have. Those quotes really summed up things that I have seen in my own experience. That's where we're talking about subjectivity. It is hard to put that to one side, but those are things that I've noticed, and I'd be interested to see if other people have noticed them. So just put a slide up here. This is because the presentation's available. If you want to read a bit more about trust, I've suggested 3 sources that I used. They're not about trust between advisors and decision makers. They're trust and risk communication between regulators and experts and the public, but a lot of those factors apply between risk assessors and decision makers. So structured frameworks, and this is really important to anybody who develops frameworks, models, and tools for risk assessment. There's relatively limited use of decision frameworks or risk assessment frameworks for practical decision making. There was some. I'm not saying they're not used, they're definitely used. But what was really obvious is that the examples were specific. I didn't find anyone talking about different organisations linking back to the same framework, or different types of decision in the same organisation linking back to the same sort of framework. Mostly they were using something that was designed specifically for that purpose. And that was interesting. So when I looked at why aren't frameworks so widely used, one of the questions was, are the frameworks too specific? Or do they need to be specific? Is that really important? One thing that came up a lot that decision makers talked about was intuition or trusting their gut. And that can be a real challenge if you're advising somebody and you're telling them an answer that's not what they're expecting. And experts having intuition is one of 2 things. It's either, not experts, decision makers, but decision makers are actually quite expert in their topic. And experts can have intuition that is really quick, really right, and almost mysterious. It's not mysterious, it's very understandable when you look at it, but someone's so familiar with something that they just go straight to that answer. The other side of intuition is cognitive bias. And actually, someone could just be relying on cognitive bias, such as they trust people who sound like them, or have the same accent as them, or who look more like them, or they've done something that worked before. And so the two sides, and I think maybe a couple of years ago I've talked about this before, about whether intuition is right or wrong, and it depends a lot on context. But that's a real challenge for anyone who's advising a decision maker, because they're going to have their own answers in their head, and they might be right and they might not be. One thing that turned up in the literature was that a lot of models and frameworks it wasn't clear that they were designed to be implemented at all. So many of them didn't have anything about implementation in the text of the publication. So they explained a model, but they didn't really talk about how they'd be used. So perhaps there was actually a lack of thinking about that in the development. And one of the publications that I read talked about the concept of knowledge transfer. So, okay, we're going to develop something, and then we're going to transfer that knowledge, and someone is going to use it, and here it is, and it sort of lands in your lap. And I've been the person who has done a whole bunch of work and something's landed in a decision maker's lap, and they're like, what on earth is this? So I've been in that process. I've been on the other side of having someone says they're doing something, they're going to develop something, they go away and do it, and they come back and you look at it and they didn't really talk to me, and they have not taken into account a whole lot of stuff. So sometimes the concept of knowledge transfer isn't the most helpful way to develop a tool that's going to be used for making decisions. And in this particular paper, they talked about the concept of co-production of knowledge as being a more helpful way of coming up with tools. And that's certainly been my experience. And one of the things that turned up in the study was there were a couple of decision makers who were really enthusiastic about using decision-making frameworks in their decisions. They were anomalous, but they were there. And they had actually had some involvement in developing that framework. So it was two of them, and it's not a representative sample, so I don't know how widespread that is, but it was my sense, supported by the literature, that if people are carried on that journey, then they're far more likely to use something, both from the perspective of having buy-in and they actually care about it, but also because it might actually be useful to them. So I've also linked to a few papers that some of them were actually for conservation. So no one's really looked at frameworks developed for biosecurity or invasive species specifically used, but they have done that for conservation, and they've found these gaps. And so those were useful papers I found on the subject. So I'm just keeping an eye on the time. It's not showing on my screen, but I'm just keeping an eye on the phone. I've spoken for about half an hour and I'm coming to my conclusions, so hoping that works reasonably well for people. Thoughts for those of you interested in developing and using models and tools and frameworks for decision making. If you want to be useful, a good model isn't enough. It could be a great model, it can be an absolutely brilliant model. It may not be enough to get your work actually used. So first thing is, think about the use of it at the start, before you start designing something. If you're advising or you want someone to use your work, you're going to need to build trust with them. Now, I know though some of you work in contexts where risk assessors and decision makers are placed a long way away from each other with a deliberate separation. That gives you a real challenge, but there are still ways of thinking about building trust. And even the tone in which you write something can influence trust. And that's a lesson that I learned many years ago in biosecurity, when working with some colleagues with whom we had very, very different ideas, and we really struggled to connect. And actually, by changing the approach to how we wrote the words on the page, that actually made a difference to trust. So even the tone that you use when writing can influence trust. So there's things you can do. And the other thing is that specifically, if you are looking at work that is going to be used for particular decisions, it can help to bring decision makers on that journey with you of developing the work that you're doing. So probably not necessarily terribly surprising conclusions, but worth thinking about. And that was just going to thank, so Susanna Finley-Smits was the social scientist who helped me with the methodology, and she was great and met up with me to talk me through the approach. And John King and Christine Reid are leading the National Science Challenge project, He Tangata, He Taiao, He Ōhanga, and work funded by the National Science Challenge, New Zealand's Biological Heritage. And then I'm going to leave people with a beautiful picture that I particularly like, because I always like to have a nice picture in the background. And thank you for everyone. I hope that I haven't spoken too fast and made my accent hard to follow. And yeah, I'll exit out of I'll stop sharing and exit out of, stop sharing. There's the button, and I will exit out of that.
Great. Thank you very much, Melanie. That was a really interesting talk. We've got a couple of questions, a few questions here. Towards the conclusion there, you sort of partly addressed this one. So it's, how does a risk assessor establish credibility in a new environment? So for example, you get the new job with a different agency, newly appointed decision maker, and the comment here that there's few shortcuts when establishing trust. So it's, could you comment on whether you had any ideas about how to go and bootstrap that situation?
I think that I think understanding how trust works is probably a really good starting point. The first thing is trust is almost the only thing there is that if you ask for it, you reduce your chances of getting it. Normally, there's no harm in asking for something. You know, what's the worst that can happen? Asking for trust is actually the only thing that you're less likely to get if you ask for it. But I think looking at what are those components of trust and thinking about how you're demonstrating them right from the start. So knowledge and expertise, I wouldn't start with trying to demonstrate knowledge and expertise. If you've just got a new job, presumably you have some knowledge and expertise, but you're probably not high in the credibility stakes because you're new. I think concern and care, so showing that you actually care about the things that you're talking about. And it's not just that you care about it from your perspective, but that you can hear the other person's perspective. So that involves some listening about what's important to them. And also just doing what you can to show that you're being open and honest. And I know this sounds like an unusual way of doing it, but clear writing is really fundamental to openness and honesty. Using only acronyms that your reader is so familiar with that it will make it harder for them if you write it out. So generally in work for MPI, New Zealand's Ministry for Primary Industries, you write MPI because it's actually going to be a pain if you write it out every time for the reader. If an acronym is, I read so many papers where there's an acronym that is used a lot, but I don't know the acronym. I'm learning about the topic and the acronym is not familiar to me, it doesn't help me because I do not retain what that acronym is in my head. That forces me to go back and forth within the paper. It's frustrating, and it's not making things clear. It's easier to hide stuff if you're not making stuff clear. So it's actually demonstrating openness by using really clear writing with a minimum of technical language that your reader needs. That's an unusual way of approaching it, but it's just really important. People trust clear language. Think about your reader feeling smart when they've finished your reading. If they've understood it, they feel smart, they're more likely to trust you.
Right. Okay, we've got a whole series of questions coming through now.
Yep.
So one from Len Coop. Thinking about invention of new ideas, R&D, and their implementation, so there's 3 areas, do you think co-production practices should be inherent in all 3 or just the latter 1 or 2 of those?
I think that, so the first one is just generating new ideas.
Yes, the ideation.
My sense is that generating new ideas probably works best with co-production. So I'm thinking about sort of my MPI experience, even not a formal co-production, but just by having a lot of interaction with, and ideas come to people often when they're alone, walking up and down the stairs, walking down the street, having a shower, cooking dinner, whatever. And not necessarily in a formal brainstorming session, but unless you're having a lot of interactions with people, you're not going to understand their needs enough to come up with an idea that might help them. So I don't know that necessarily formal co-production for coming up with ideas is necessary, but I think that having those links is.
Okay. Next one from Abby Walter in the US. The observation that decision makers are more enthusiastic about using decision frameworks when they have a role in developing the framework is interesting. So the question, in your opinion, are decision makers only enthusiastic about frameworks they've personally had a role in developing, or might they also trust a framework that was developed by another decision maker, for example, another person in the same organization? So some referent group.
I think that they would. I mean, there were others who talked about frameworks that they sort of used, that they'd picked up and used. I don't know that they would necessarily have to be involved, but I think they would have to see it as really adding value to them. And I think that by having had that input, they see it as adding value. They're more likely to recognise the value. But I think if it came from someone who was trusted by them, for example, then they wouldn't necessarily have to be involved. And I mean, it's just not possible to involve everybody in developing everything that they're going to use. So there have to be solutions that involve actually, passing it on to people. But I think that role of trust.
Right. So a trusted colleague who's facing the same problems, same types of decisions. They say, I've used this framework and it's a great framework, that's more likely to...
Someone with lots of knowledge and experience and who, that they care about, or that they care what they think.
Right. Okay, another one from Andrew Robinson. Great presentation, Melanie. 2 questions. How well do you think your conclusions would generalize to other countries? Good one. And secondly, can we anticipate a publication from this very interesting work?
So, in theory, none of this is applicable to anything but the people I spoke to, because it's qualitative. But in practice, I would be surprised if you didn't see some of these same themes in other countries. I do know that there was one big bias in my work, that there was one agency I didn't speak to which has far more structure around their work. And so some of the theme of not using structured frameworks was biased by the fact that nobody was available from this organisation despite me giving them, they were just busy and it was bad timing. And so but I would be surprised if people didn't find some of these themes in at least some areas of other decision making, because I know, talking to other risk assessors, I hear similar experiences to what I've had as a risk assessor. So I'd be very surprised if there weren't some common elements in decision makers. And the short answer to the first one, to the second one, is that I've written up 2 reports, one on the literature and one on the interview work. I'm allowed to send those to people if people are interested. I would like to publish them somewhere, but I need to talk to the social scientist about how you approach that, because I need to figure out where would be suitable for publishing qualitative studies, and also how to condense down what I did, because, you know, it's like a 30-page report with quite a lot of detail, and how to condense that down and explain everything in something that's more suitable for a journal.
Right. I know we've got a fair few members in IPRRG who are operating in this space. So I'm thinking there's possibly an opportunity either for an online get together where you could try and test some of that generality question that Andrew's talking about, or failing that, at our next face-to-face meeting, that we organise a special session there where you could sit down and try and explore some of that, maybe build on that, because I think that's, you know, it's a really important question.
Yeah, I'd love to do that.
It feels like a lot of what you've uncovered is it's very human, emotional.
Yeah.
Thing, so it would tend to be fairly general. Okay, got one last question here from Susie Perry. Excellent webinar, thank you, Melanie. Did you have the opportunity to look at risk governance and how it influences decisions and the effectiveness of stakeholder engagement in risk management and policy decisions? I'll read that out for you again if you like.
Yeah.
It's quite complicated. So did you?
Yeah. Did I look at risk governance and
how it influences decisions and the effectiveness of stakeholder engagement in risk management and policy decisions?
So no, that wasn't part of the work. I think that would be quite interesting, because, say, for example, looking at this one organisation that is very structured about how they go through their decision-making processes. You know, why are they so structured about it and certain other ones not? And understanding, for example, those differences. There is potentially in this research program, the wider project, there is potentially some work coming up, not really about the effectiveness of engagement, but it is looking at what is considered a good decision by participants and stakeholders and all of the participants in the biosecurity system. So it's not quite about the effectiveness of engagement, but it does relate to that by actually looking at how people define what a good decision is and what is a good process. And so that might, from a slightly side angle, get at that question, but not at the moment.
Right. Okay. Good. Thank you. We've got another one from Andrew here. So, did you notice a difference between the trust appetites, for want of a better phrase, of Māori and Pākehā decision makers? Was there a pattern there?
So, officially, I didn't ask anyone ethnicity questions. Unofficially, to my knowledge, I was only speaking to Pākehā decision makers, with, as far as I could tell, and by the wording that people used, and it was like 2/3 male, 1/3 female, which is a reasonable representation of the biosecurity system, which would be white and majority male, but with a reasonable minority of women. So, and there weren't any obvious there weren't particularly obvious differences in how much decision makers trusted or didn't trust. So there were probably some who seemed a bit more cynical and suspicious, and some who seemed a bit more have a bit more confidence in the information coming to them. But there was not an obvious pattern. What it was really that all of the decision makers trusted some advisors and not other advisors. That was more the pattern. So it was often at an individual level, which is both positive and challenging. I think it's positive because it does suggest that you have an opportunity with any decision maker to build trust. But on the other, it's what builds trust. Do they trust someone because they look like them? Which is really challenging. Or is it about how you do it?
Right. Hey, two more. The questions keep coming. This is great. From Shola, great talk. Thanks, Melanie. What were some of the inconsistencies in the use of values in decision making?
So most of the decision makers talked about, well, we consider economic values and environmental values and social values and cultural values. But a lot of them didn't say how they did that. And some of them identified that they've found some of them more difficult than others. So a reasonable number seemed quite confident with with economic. And some felt confident with environment. Almost none were confident or could explain how they took social and cultural values into account. Again, there were anomalies. So there were a couple of them who were, and this was, I think, in the report, they were in local government, who were really confident taking the views of their local iwi and hapu into account. And not just confident, but enthusiastic about it. And they could explain how they did it. Others were like, I don't even know what that is. And I think everyone acknowledged that they needed to take a wider range of values into account, but there was real differences in the degree to which they did that. The report goes into, in particular, because part of the project is looking at how Māori cultural values are taken into account, I go into that in some detail. I haven't included that in the talk.
Okay, thank you. Looks like we might have come to our last question now. So from another one from Lynn Coop. Did you assess years of experience or other proxies of expertise in the willingness to use risk assessments?
That wasn't something I looked at. There wasn't a lot of demographic work at the start. And I think if I was doing this again, I would actually include a bit more demographic data in that. And in that case, you might be able to have a better chance of identifying whether there were any patterns. But really the only demographic thing that we could analyse was, in particular, what organisation somebody worked for. That was probably the only factor where there was some meaningful pattern. And for example, local government who work in a very much place-based way of operating, they've got a defined area, were somewhat better at taking Māori cultural values into account because they would have a particular group or groups that they needed to interact with, whereas central government struggled a lot.
Right.
But yeah, I think
Thank you so much.
Next time.
I think the enthusiasm that we've seen in the questions is highlighting that this is an area that's really rich for investigation, and clearly, what you've done is really great. But it seems like it's just the start of you've just sort of revealed that there is this great area of research, and it's something that IPRRG is sort of baked into the DNA of the group, that we're interested in this problem. So thank you so much, Melanie, for putting effort into
Thank you.
this presentation.
I've talk.
I really appreciate that.
Sorry I don't have a bunch of faces that I'm talking to.
Next year we're aiming for face-to-face.
Yep.
But yes, I'm sure the positive feedback there in the questions.
Yeah, well, thanks everyone for asking questions.
Yeah, no, much appreciated. Thank you, everyone. On that note, I think we'll call it quits.
Yeah, that's great. Bye, everyone.
Keep well. Bye-bye.